Hello and thanks for joining us. I am Obiora Ilo. Today I have an African. I like to refer to a different kind of African. A man who fought in the trenches in South Africa, though he was not black, but he stood with the blacks and fought for the freedom of South Africa. He fought for a South Africa where neither the white nor the black was going to be dominated. In the process of doing that, he partnered and worked with other great names in South Africa. He went to prison at a young age and suffered for what he believed in. It is my pleasure to welcome Dennis Theodore Goldberg.
Good day to you. Good to be here.
Yeah, Mr. Goldberg, you're welcome.
Thank you.
In 1960, you went to prison.
Yes.
And in 1963 and 1964, you stood alongside the great Nelson Mandela,
Yes.
facing what many described even then as the trial of the century. Can you look back and tell me about those days?
Well, we had taken up arms to conduct an armed struggle against the apartheid racism by law, backed up by armed force, massive armed forces and police force. Any civilian peaceful protests were met with force. People were shot dead, there were massacres, there were imprisonments. Even the women protesting in a huge march to the seat of government in Pretoria, the police turned their dogs on them, ripped their beautiful dresses to pieces. And you mustn't mess with the women. They inspired the men to fight back even harder. That was 1956, I think. And so there was a need to put an end to this violence. But there was a need to put an end to the indignity of apartheid. Black people were treated as though they were not people. In South Africa, the hierarchy was whites, then people called colored, and then people called Indian, Asian, and then Africans, who were 2/3 of the population, who had no political rights, could not vote, could not sit in parliament, could not go on strike, that was illegal, had to get permission if they wanted to go from the countryside to the city to work, and if they got permission had to leave their wives and children behind. What sort of a country is that? How growing up, as I did in World War II, where even white South Africa joined Britain and the other allies against Nazi Germany, against racism, against domination and control. And yet in South Africa, we practiced all the very things that we were fighting against. So even as a little boy, I mean, I was 12 at the end of World War II, I knew this was wrong. My parents were political activists. They'd come from England. They rejected racism. We had people of all races in our house. I knew people. I respected them. We'd sit at supper. There's one little potato left, and I would want it, and my mother would offer it to a visitor. Doesn't matter if he's black or white. Family hold back. You serve your guests. You respect people. And so this is what I learned. And as I grew up, I wanted to be an engineer. I wanted to build houses and railways and roads and bridges for people. That was my dream. And I was able to get to university because I'm a white kid. And my father had a tough time keeping me there, but he made it. Education's important, of course. And then I discovered I could build for white South Africans, not black South Africans, not for people. So first you change the country, then you can be an engineer. And it took too long, so I never became an engineer again. Why get involved? Because it was wrong. And not just that the police operated in brutal ways and racism by law, and hundreds of thousands of people went to prison every year under the pass laws that controlled the lives of black South Africans. Children died of starvation in a rich country. in the Eastern Cape province, where Nelson Mandela comes from, half of all children were dead by age 5 years from hunger, lack of medical care. For whites, there was one doctor for 400 people, and then specialists and hospitals on top. For black South Africans, one doctor for 80,000 people. Better in Soweto, in the black townships, one doctor for 3,000 people. I mean, the total injustice of it, and who created the wealth? Black mine workers, black labourers, black workers. And so apartheid wasn't just about racism. Racism was the instrument of creating cheap labour. I like to say cheap labour makes fat profits. In the gold mines, in industries, in factories, in commerce, in transport, in the quarries. That's where the wealth of our country comes from, and people weren't sharing in it. And half of our people were never employed in the formal economy, over half. They were kept in the reserves. 2/3 of the population were given 13% of the land. Whites took the best land for themselves. Why? You can't make a living off the land, you've got to go to work. And you've got to go to work for whatever wage you can get, because you've got to pay taxes in money. A hut tax, a wife tax, a dog tax. I'm putting them together deliberately that way. And a cow tax and so on. And if the man got the job, then he had to send money home to keep the family, but he couldn't take the family with him. So the family was broken. The children grew up without their dads. It's not good for children. And I grew up knowing all of this. And I knew black workers went on strike, and I knew the women protested. And I felt I had to help, otherwise I'm part of the brutality. Okay. I didn't want to be part of the brutality.
Okay, you know, a lot of Africans who are not South Africans keep wondering whether that was South Africa the way it had always been. But I remember that apartheid was backed by law in 1948.
Yeah.
What was life in South Africa before 1948, when the National Party came and constitutionalized apartheid?
You know, it was a change in the sense of intensifying the racial segregation. Mm-hmm. It was called racial segregation under British colonial rule, and then English-based industry and commerce, and dominant English. And then the Afrikaners always wanted their place in the sun as whites. But they had to play catch-up. They weren't in the big business field. They'd been kept out of it. How were they going to catch up? They were going to use government and laws to create the conditions where they could get rich quick. And in 20 years, there was a stratum of very rich white Afrikaans-speaking South Africans who were made partners with English-speaking South Africans to exploit black workers much more intensively. But for over 300 years we've had racial segregation, nearly 400 years now, ever more intense. It was a way when diamonds, it was always there when farmers settled and they took the land and stole the cattle, and when the indigenous people took the cattle back again, they called them thieves and had wars. And the British Empire took control in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. It took a whole century to conquer South Africa. And they had troops from all over the British Commonwealth, India and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and so on, to fight the African people. And they conquered them one tribe after another. And the Zulu people were the last to be conquered. In 1906, King Bambata of the Zulu people, he trained his people to use firearms. And they put up a tremendous resistance, but they couldn't fight against the whole army. And the British, when they'd conquered the Zulu people, they cut off Chief Bambata's head, and put it on a pike staff and carried it around to say, you see what happens to you when you fight against the British. They called themselves civilized.
And that gave rise to, of course, the African National Congress, civil disobedience.
Yes, what do you call it? Gandhiist ideas of peaceful, passive resistance. But, you know, it wasn't like India, where in a country of 400 million people at the time, 10,000 British soldiers and administrators controlled everything. They could go home. In South Africa, there were millions of whites. Nobody wanted them. And so, in effect, they became part of South Africa, and they couldn't be driven out unless you killed them. And in South Africa, fortunately, I think, for white people and African people themselves, there is this philosophy of African humanism. We call it Ubuntu. We are who we are only through other people. In other words, we must be respectful and equal. And apartheid could not be equal. Not just because of the violence, but because it was inherently unequal. And so our people said enough's enough.
The Sharpeville massacre was one event that jolted the world.
Indeed.
It opened the eyes of the world to what was going on in South Africa. Tell me what happened and how, I mean, watching from a very close point, how you could describe the events of that year.
You know, the gradual development of anti-pass law campaigns, for men especially, but they wanted to impose them on women as well. And there was great rivalry between the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, which broke away from the ANC over the Freedom Charter, which said South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And the Pan-Africanist Congress said, no, it belongs only to black South Africans. And so we were all our political movements were working to put an end to the pass laws. And the PAC called for a huge protest rally at Sharpeville near Johannesburg. And some thousands of people gathered to hand in their passbooks as a way of peaceful protest. The police opened fire and shot 69 people dead in just a few minutes. They said they were shot at. It was never true. They wounded, I think, 189 people. In Cape Town, 3 were murdered. I live in Cape Town. And some, I don't remember how many, were wounded. But Parliament sits in Cape Town. It was in session. And the next morning, some 30,000 people marched out of the black townships to Parliament to protest. Of course, the police stopped them. A young student, Philip Khasana, led the march in little short pants. And he was induced to speak to the chief of police, who then arrested him. And the Parliament declared a state of emergency. Some 20,000 people were arrested. And the world really did sit up and take notice. And I think that was really the birth of the worldwide anti-apartheid movement. So that our struggle internally had backing from people all over the world. Western governments, their people tried to force them to act because they supported apartheid, they supported the investment of big business, mines, industry. The countries of Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc, supported our struggle directly with formal committees guided from above to provide solidarity from masses of people. And all of this made it a worldwide issue. Eventually, the British Commonwealth met the heads of state and said they were going to expel South Africa over its policies, racial policies. The new countries independent in Africa, Ghana and Nigeria and so on. And the South African government under Dr. Verwoerd withdrew before they could be expelled. And then said they were going to create a republic. And we called a protest because the whites only voted for a republic. And we didn't mind if we were a republic or we had a queen. That wasn't important. What was important was that the constitution of the new republic, White Republic, said there shall never be equality in church and state between black and white. But the whole movement of our people through our Freedom Charter, for example, where 10,000 of meetings were held, where people could say what they wanted, our move from between African, coloured and Indian people and the African National Congress and the Congress Alliance was for a non-racial South Africa. We called it multiracial in those days. And here we were entrenching racism. So a general strike was called. And the apartheid government called out all its soldiers, 200,000 armed people, to crush this strike. We called it a stay-at-home, because striking was illegal for black workers, but staying at home was a little legal nicety. And they simply crushed it with armed force and forced people back to work at gunpoint. And so our people started talking of taking up arms. There was a treason trial. The apartheid government said the Freedom Charter was high treason. How could you change the government unless you used force? The very basis of it. So that's high treason. Trial went on for 4 years, 156 people arrested. And the great leaders were together every day. Even during the state of emergency, black leaders all together. It was like being in permanent political plenary session. In the end, after 4 years, they were found not guilty. But there was a new strength of purpose in the Congress Alliance. And there were individuals who wanted to go out and commit acts of terrorism, random acts against any white. And since the ANC, led by the Youth League in the 1940s, had said, no, people are people and all must have equal rights.
I want to take you back to 1961. The apartheid struggle was, kind of copied what Mahatma Gandhi had done in India, violent resistance. But in 1961, the struggle changed with the founding of Nkonto Wesizwe.
You say it very well.
What brought about that transition?
I think two major events, the Sharpeville massacre and then the crushing of the general strike in 1961, and the determination of the apartheid government to crush all peaceful protest. There was nothing more we could do peacefully. And our people were saying, we can't go on like this. In 1961, I was asked to go out to one of the townships about 120 kilometers from my home, a small town in the north of Cape Town, to take pamphlets to say we're going on strike. Chief Lutuli has burnt his pass and he's calling a general strike against the Republic. And I got there. I went to visit comrades who put me in the back of a van, covered me with sacks, so I couldn't be seen, to drive me into a black township because it was illegal for me to go in. And I met with the local committee of the ANC with these leaflets. And they said, comrade, we can't do it. Our people suffered so badly, lost their jobs after the 1960 Sharpeville massacre and the protest. They're still trying to recover. If we call on them to go on strike, they won't. And so we have to find a new way. You have to be able to protect our people. We have to collectively protect our people from the might of the apartheid state. And so there were individuals who were going out and committing acts of terror. That was the mood of our people. You can't go on an armed struggle unless people are ready to go. So Nelson Mandela and Joe Slovo of the Communist Party and others were arguing for this. But it meant that you had to persuade the various executive provincial committees and executives of the African National Congress and the other Congress organizations that this was the right move. You take up arms, you know the state is going to crack down. You're putting your lives on the line. Maybe they'll put everybody in prison. Maybe they'll kill thousands of people. That's been happening in other countries. And so Nelson Mandela, who had left South Africa illegally, to travel through Africa to meet political leaders and find out what support there was for this idea. He got some military training in Algeria as well, came back, eluded the police for 11 months or more, and then was betrayed and arrested and sent to prison for 5 years. But they didn't know he was the actual commander of this Umkhonto weSizwe. That they only found when they raided the Rivonia Liliesleaf Farm headquarters in 1963 and found his diaries. And our lawyers said, "Why do you have such a sense of history? You keep notes of every illegal thing you've done." But what the diaries showed, I'm leaping ahead a bit, what it showed was that we're not terrorists. We were setting out to overthrow a tyrannical regime, and our policy was that we would try to avoid taking life. We would act against symbols of apartheid, the offices where the passes were issued, post offices, police stations, power lines. But the police didn't have the same attitude. Death was no problem for the police, none at all. And so, why did it change in 1961? Because the time was right. There was no way forward through peaceful protest. They were determined to hold on to power, and our people said no.
Looking back to those days, the ferocity, the impunity of the white government, they were ready to kill. They were ready to destroy. They were ready to throw people into prison, life sentence and all that. And here you were, about 29 years, and you didn't bother about what could have happened to you. You could have died. I mean, when you were being smuggled into the black townships, anything could have happened to you.
True.
What was driving you? What was at the back of your mind? What was it that made you sacrifice your privileges as a white person?
And my family and their privileges and my kids. Why did I do it? Because it was necessary. I could not be part of the injustice and making the injustice. My conscience would not allow it. I told you before, I grew up during World War II. I was filled with the heroism of people who fought behind the Nazi lines, at the risk of their lives, even young people, to be free. And if they could do it, why couldn't we do it? And if the people of Vietnam could fight the French and then the Japanese, then the French, and the people of Algeria could fight the French and fight the French and fight the French, and the people of Cuba could be struggling for freedom, why couldn't our people? It was the right thing to do.
But you were white. They were not your people.
Yes, they were my people. All people are my people. This is what I'm trying to tell you. It's about justice. It's about equality. It's about respect for human dignity and life. It's about not using race to exploit people, not using race to kill people. It's about wanting to be able to choose my friends because I like them and they like me, not because of the color of their skin.
You didn't fear for your life?
Yes, of course I did. You take up arms against a state, they're going to kill you.
Or was it youthful exuberance?
Maybe we were a bit romantic, but I didn't expect to survive it. I would if it was great luck, you know, good fortune. But you take up arms, you run the risk of death.
Let me take
But people are dying every day from apartheid, not just murder and violence, from the system.
Let me take you back to the trials.
Yeah.
Because for the world, that was Nelson Mandela's coming of age. Yeah. That was when the world saw the inside of him.
Yeah, that's right.
And saw the strength of his character. Yeah. Tell me about it. Here was a man who faced the risk of a life sentence, even faced the risk of being killed. And he stood up to the whites and made that very, very wonderful speech that has become one of the greatest speeches the world had ever seen.
And he was standing there, next to him was Walter Sisulu, then me, and Govan Mbeki and Ahmed Kathrada and Rusty Bernstein, Elias Matsoledi and Andrew Mlangeni. And Nelson Mandela makes his speech impassioned. No shouting. No, it was a very reasoned speech. It was to show why we took up arms, why he had led this. He said openly, I called for it. He called for it himself. And when he ended with this in effect, he's saying to the judge, hang me if you dare to. Oh, by the way, hang Walter, hang Dennis, hang us all. And what I remember is just sheer pride in sharing this moment. The man had such elegance. There was strain in his voice, but he wasn't shouting. And when he finished, there was an absolute silence, a long drawn-out silence in the court. And what a moment to share of his greatness, and to think of ours, because he was challenging the judge to hang us. And the death threat was real, and the prosecution wanted it. And I know that because I was white, and a technical expert, and the judge making a remark with, ask that clever engineer number 3 accused, and he'll tell you something, showed his own hatred, because I'm white and I'm betraying white South Africa. Nelson Mandela, and we all thought he could be hanged. I thought maybe they would hang me because if Nelson was hanged, then there would be an uprising. If they hanged me, white South Africa would be very pleased. My comrades would protest, but they wouldn't rise up for me. I wasn't senior enough. I wasn't that important. Important enough, but not that important. In the end, Nelson made his speech. We all gave our evidence. Elias Matsoledi made a wonderful speech from the dock. Didn't give evidence, saying why he had been a political activist, what acts were done against him and his people, the theft of the land, the starvation, the disease. Andrew Mlangeni, the same.
Were you asked to make a speech?
No, I insisted that I be able to give evidence. The lawyers were worried that I would make it worse for myself, because my defense against the threat of death was to make jokes. And maybe the judge would get angry with me. But I wanted to give evidence. I wanted to be able to say why I did what I did, like I'm trying to explain now. It wasn't because I wanted to kill, it's because I wanted to put an end to the killing. Really, that was our motive by all of us.
You know, we look at it now and it's history. You're telling me a story. But in 63, 64, you were staring death in the face, standing in that court.
I was very thin and I just turned sideways round the gallows. What can I say to you? I hoped we wouldn't die. I didn't want to die. But I too was prepared to die for our people to be free.
What did your parents think of you then?
Oh, my parents were very proud of me. the day I was sentenced to life imprisonment, or the next day, my mother said that her life was fulfilled through me. I wasn't just her little boy anymore, I was her comrade. And I was proud.
That was what she said?
Yeah, yeah. But our people, the day we were sentenced to life imprisonment, my mother couldn't hear what the judge said. He spoke so quietly. She said, "What is it?" And I said, "It's life, and life's wonderful." We all smiled a little bit, and then we laughed because we'd escaped the death sentence. Nelson as well. And then when I look back at the way our history has evolved and the role Nelson Mandela has since played, how lucky we are as a country and as a world that people like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Govan Mbeki, the father of our second president, and my other comrades and me, that our lives were spared and we could take part in rebuilding our country and making sure it didn't go down in flames.
You know, you were a young man. You had this brilliant life in front of you, but you chose to stay and fight, and ended up in prison at a very early age. But even before all this time, you wanted to be an engineer.
I was a graduate civil engineer. And
but you still went to school while you were in prison?
We were allowed to study by correspondence through a distance learning University of South Africa. And I took a degree in public administration because I thought I have to be ready for when we take power. I finished that degree very quick, 5 years. But it took 22 years, 30 years before I could have been an administrator. I was sure they could not last that long. Then I did a bachelor degree in history and geography. And part of studying was for the lights to stay on at night. Otherwise you had to go to sleep as soon as about 8 o'clock. How can you sleep for 10 hours every night with nothing to do? Then I did a degree in library science, because that's all there was left for me to study. And that took a long time. And then eventually they said we could study second level degrees, so I started a law degree. And I got halfway through it, so I'm half a lawyer.
When you were released?
And then I got released. Enough lawyers around, I never finished the degree.
Tell me a typical day in prison.
It changed over the years, but around about 5 o'clock you would hear the shovels going as they were putting coal into the boilers to cook the breakfast, make the pap. And then around about 6 o'clock they'd come and open your grill, and an officer would come around to inspect you. He'd walk past, you know, this is inspected, yeah. Then they'd let us out for about half an hour to go and empty out toilet buckets and wash and clean the bucket. And then come back, then they'd bring our food in a chipped enamel bowl. Sometimes they put the bread in the pup. It was nice bread at first. Otherwise they put the bread on the floor. There was no respect for prisoners. It doesn't matter white or black. And then we had a couple of hours where we had to work sewing mail bags, repairing old post sacks. We're just keeping us busy. Filthy work, insisting we don't talk to each other. In winter in Pretoria, I was in prison in Pretoria, not Robben Island. Temperature goes down to very cold, sometimes frosty, you know, 0, but 2-3 degrees, and then it warms up a bit. But in the prison courtyard where we sat was 3 stories high, no sunlight. And you sit for 3 hours and you can hardly move afterwards, you're so stiff. Then they'd lock us up for lunch for a couple of hours while the warders went off. Then we'd have another afternoon session of work. And the day ends, 3:30, locked up. And then you're alone for 18 hours till they opened up the next morning.
You were in a white prison in Pretoria.
Yeah.
And this was the situation in a white prison.
Yeah.
How could it have been in a black prison?
Well, they say everything is culturally arranged. So we got meat most days of the week, but on one day of the week we got fish. And there were vegetables and there was rice. And they said it was a balanced diet. But if you scratched yourself, it didn't heal. There was a lack of vitamins, lack of sunlight. And it's not really about the food you eat, unless it's impossible. I mean, I ate soup every night, made from powder, in prison, every night for 22 years.
Is that milk?
Soup.
Soup.
Soup. Bean soup, pea soup, ground up green peas. Not very nice. I still love soup, but real soup. And what was it like on Robben Island? Separate diet scale for black Africans. Separate clothing. Short pants, no socks, open sandals. For coloured prisoners, long trousers. Better food. For Indians, also like coloured people. They said this was culturally arranged. It took a very long time to get equality of clothing and food served by the prison services. It was a battle fought in prison for rights. Never stopped.
So outside prison, you fought for rights. Inside prison, you fought for rights too.
And in prison, it cost you stomach ulcers and illness. It took 15 years for us to win their respect and to be treated as decent people. Sometimes they still tried nasty things.
Yeah, I said there was something you said that attracted my attention so much, that even while you were in prison on a life sentence, you were dreaming of working in a free South Africa.
Yes.
And you were trying to get degrees.
Yes.
What gave, what gave strength to this dream?
Well, I was surprised it took so long. I thought apartheid would be dead, not from a romantic view. It had so many inherent weaknesses that I thought it would collapse much earlier. It's a lesson in history. It takes a long time. Everywhere but you have to make the start. You can't say, well, if it takes 5 years, okay, otherwise I give up. What does the strength come from? Maybe we just believed that we could win. And you know, our movement made us symbols of freedom. When I said Oliver Tambo made Nelson Mandela famous, Free Mandela became the worldwide campaign. But he stood for all political prisoners. And there were buttons and badges and posters and things with my face as well. All of us, in the Rivonia trial. They made us famous, you know.
So in 1985, you were released from prison.
Yes.
But it was a life sentence. Why did they change their mind?
Governments reserve the right to change their minds. Actually, my visitor friend, a woman who really was my visitor for 14 years, her husband was a lawyer, one of our defense lawyers. She went to see the Minister of Justice to say, it's time that Dennis is released. And he said he'd give her half an hour, and he gave her over an hour. And he took notice of what she said, because he said, he told one of the diplomats, and I heard about it afterwards, he's not only the top lawyer, he's a leading politician. What happens if elderly people like Mandela die in prison? There'd be trouble. So we better start thinking about what to do. I was the guinea pig. They offered me release on conditions, and I accepted, because I believed it was necessary to move things forward, to negotiate. 5 years later, the others having been released in between, Nelson Mandela was released to negotiate. Everything I asked for in a letter I wrote to the apartheid president before my release, not pleading for myself, pleading for a change of policy for our country, came to pass in 5 years. So I accepted the release, came out, and was politically active like I've never been before. Really and truly, I traveled the world talking about our struggle, winning solidarity, winning financial support, winning political support, not just from people, from governments. That was my task. Why did they release me? Because they had to. The big Western powers wanted an end to this situation. The Cold War was coming to an end. If they could get Cuba out of Africa, they would be happy. All of it came together.
So you traveled the world,
Yes.
making the case for the ANC and the future of South Africa.
Yes.
And I was wondering, at what point did family come into the story?
I arrived back in England, and my wife, after a little while, said she felt cheated.
Were you married before you went to prison?
Oh yes, and we had 2 children, and my children, who had been 8 years and 6 years, were now 30 and 28 years old. And my wife, who was a beautiful young woman in her 30s, was now close on 60. She said my little country cottage had become a big mansion. And I was bald and old with gold-rimmed spectacles. But I had to be active. My comrades were still in prison. And she felt cheated because I wasn't home with her.
Even when you were out of prison?
Even when I came out of prison.
And she had waited for over 20 years.
Yeah. And she supported me in what I was doing. She gave me a home, she gave me love. I could not live on the allowance the ANC gave me. It was less than half of a street sweeper's pay. We had a struggle. It wasn't about living well. And so I traveled the world and I spoke at the United Nations Special Committee on a couple of occasions. Made some pretty good speeches as well, I have to say. Raised huge amounts of support for our people and our struggle. Persuaded governments to give financial support for the welfare of our prisoners and their families. And slowly, slowly, the West began to say, we better get rid of apartheid or we lose all our investments, and put pressure. And so Mandela's released, and the day we were sentenced, the head of prison security, a colonel, was very angry with me because I said, you look so happy about the sentences, the life sentence. He said, they should have hanged you. You'll never walk out of here on your own feet. We'll carry you out feet first in a coffin. He's really angry and bitter. We all walked out, but Nelson walked out to the world's television cameras. He arrives at the gate of the prison in this convoy of cars, and he gets out of the car, takes his wife's hand, and walks into freedom. It was a long walk to freedom.
Very long walk to freedom.
You see. And what a moment that was, of rejoicing, of delight, that in the end the apartheid government had to release him or go down in flames. It was very important. I was in England, sitting in a television studio commenting and telling the story about Mandela walking out, not in a coffin. And you know, what people forget is that in the 4 years from his release to him becoming president, during peaceful negotiations, the apartheid state killed at least 10,000 people through its security forces and death squads. But they still called it a bloodless revolution because very few whites died and only their blood counts in the eyes of the media. This is one of the biggest tragedies, I think, of our struggle, is that the thousands of people who gave their lives are being ignored. Yes, Nelson Mandela is a great leader. He played such an important role, called for the armed struggle. Then it was taken over, led by Oliver Tambo, to the point where apartheid had to negotiate, and Mandela had the strength of purpose to say, now we can call off the armed struggle because our people are dying every day. Hundreds were being killed. We didn't go to war for our people to die. And so we had to make concessions. And now they're rejoicing Nelson Mandela is the peacemaker. He was a strong man. He was a tough guy. He called for the armed struggle.
And he called for peace.
And then he called for peace because the purpose was to achieve peace.
Was he a very realistic man?
I find the brilliance of his leadership was that at each critical point, he was able to, with Oliver Tambo and others, and especially Walter Sisulu, to find a way forward, an answer to the new problems. Your struggle creates new problems.
It's not dynamic.
Yeah, very. So you need new answers, and he could find them and convince us that it was right.
When Nelson became president, when he walked out of prison 4 years after he became president, did you feel you had won the battle?
Oh no, I
Did you feel that now you are fulfilled and the battle was over?
Like he says in his autobiography, now the real struggle begins, and it's going to be harder than putting an end to apartheid.
Did the 4 years of Nelson Mandela change much in South Africa?
Yeah. His presidency?
Yes.
Absolutely. It laid the basis of a real democracy. We had our first elections. People stood in queues for 6 hours to vote. And when they were asked, aren't you impatient? They said, I waited 300 years. What's 6 hours? Seriously. And there was a rejoicing, and Nelson Mandela also says he realized in his time in prison that not only did we have to free the oppressed, we had to free the oppressor, to be human beings, to lance the boil of their brutality. It was an important change.
Were you surprised when 4 years after his presidency, he said he wasn't going to...
5 years.
5 years after his presidency, and he said, I was going home. Were you surprised, or was it typical of the man he was?
It is typical of the man. It's not about him, it's about freedom. It's about the prize of democracy, non-racialism, non-sexism. And he was tired. But you see, having brought us with Tambo and others to freedom, and having had to pacify the risk of a counter-revolution by the white security forces, people were beginning to say, but what about us? We made a revolution to change the lives of black South Africans. Why are we so kind to the whites? Why aren't we doing more for black South Africans? And so he made a farewell speech at an ANC conference in Mafeking in near the northwest of our country. And the conciliation was gone. He made a tough speech. A speech I believe was clearly written by the new president, going to be Thabo Mbeki. The time had come for a change of policy, and Nelson could not have changed at that time. And so he said, there are new tasks. I've brought us to this point. It needs younger people with more energy. And so he stepped down, making a point about democracy. And there were times during his presidency where he issued decrees and was challenged in our constitutional court and found to have exceeded his powers. And he said, okay, I withdraw the decree. Not going to fight it, because democracy is a very tender little flower. And if you don't listen to the court, you destroy the democracy right at the beginning. Yes, what a courageous man.
Let me ask you a personal question. I mean, you did so much for the struggle.
Yeah.
You spent so many years behind bars. Yeah. You couldn't pay as much attention to the kids as you would have wanted to. Yeah. And then the new South Africa comes into being.
Yeah.
And then many people thought you would have been like a minister or one of those big positions. But the little you had, you didn't complain.
Well, I didn't do it to get rich. I didn't do it for me. I did it for principle, like my comrades of my generation. It wasn't about the self, it was about principles. That's what we lived for and lived by.
Do you have any regrets?
Yes, I got caught. I shouldn't have got caught. I should have done more. Should have done better.
When you came back, years after you came back, you lost your daughter at 42.
Yeah, 42. Okay, yeah.
How did you feel?
Devastated. She was my great supporter all the years of imprisonment. And when I came out, she couldn't understand that I wasn't just going to be home with my daughter and my son and my wife. She felt so hurt. Took her 4 years to learn to accept me again. But she had a little boy before she died. He was 9 years old. He's nearly 21 now. And I wish I'd understood my daughter better. I wish I'd understood her better, because she was essentially a good person who was badly hurt by my absence. All our kids, Nelson Mandela's kids, other leaders' kids, other families' kids. Not everybody's daddy or mommy goes to prison. And they feel deserted and feel, why did I have to suffer?
The symbol of that struggle, Nelson Mandela, is dead.
Yes.
If you were asked to make a very short speech on Sunday when he'll be buried, can you share that speech with us?
Yes. We have lost a man with vision and the courage to follow it. A vision, a selfless vision for humanity, for respect, for dignity, with courage. It's not that we weren't afraid. Courage is overcoming your fear to do something that's necessary. And I believe the greatness of people, of any person, what gives meaning to life is your ability to serve people collectively with others for the benefit of all. Nelson Mandela lived his life in that way. And I say, Hamba gashle, comrade. Go well, comrade. We shall miss you.
And what do you think is the future of South Africa?
We will go on building our democracy. We will go on overcoming the problems as they arise. I hope the ANC will find a new life, able to overcome some of the weaknesses that have crept in, greed, things like that. And I think we will do it. I'm confident. We've done so much in 20 years, and 20 years in the life of a nation is like the blink of an eyelash, really and truly. But there's a lot to do. We've done a lot, and we've got to do a lot more. And we will do it. One way or another, we're going to do it. And we fight against the lack of democracy sometimes, but there's a vibrant democracy. There's opposition. People get in the streets. People make speeches. I think that's very important.
I must thank you for your time and for taking us back to the years.
Thank you for inviting me.
Our program with Dennis Theodore Goldberg, anti-apartheid activist and one of the statesmen of South Africa. I'm Obi Orailo. Thanks for watching.